So that's a really good question. But yes.
Yes, sir.
Firstly, I want to know what Obama said about work.
Oh, yeah. Okay, I'll look it up while you talk. Go ahead.
Secondly, as it relates to Obama, I want to know what you think he should be doing, if anything, differently as a black leader to tell these stories.
Well, we probably don't have enough time to fully unpack that, but he could be more honest with, I mean, he doesn't say anything about mass incarceration or our prison system. He certainly lent his support behind limiting the crack cocaine disparity, which is one of his major accomplishments. I don't mean to be so cynical, okay. One of his major accomplishments, as opposed to the air quotes. 18 to 1, but there was no retroactive, so you got sentenced on 100 to 1 disparity back in the day, you're still in sentence on the 100 to 1 disparity. So okay, positives about compromise, fine. But it was not the beginning of a conversation about the racialization of our criminal justice system. And that's I mean, this system is gigantic and it is racist. And there's no way around it. And the war on drugs is still being, it's not clear what the president's going to make of or the attorney general who works for the president is going to make of what happened in Colorado or Washington around marijuana. We know right now things are quiet because they've got sequester and a whole bunch of other stuff going on. But if I just take that issue alone, there's huge opportunity. He can use the bully pulpit of his rhetoric to say, even the most facile of choices, like Clinton's national conversation about race, could start with a national conversation about race in the criminal justice system. Now, I am serving on a federal committee, but it's Congress that put that committee together, which is to study incarceration, not the White House. So then there's this whole history lesson. So to your question, I think this will get you to what I feel has been the dishonesty of the president in terms of where we are as a country on the matter of race, and has used his individualism as an example of America's greatness. And that, I think, has done more harm than good. So this is what he says about King in reference to the speech about Hadia Pendleton. He says that, in the speech he says, his goal, King, was to free us, and I'm quoting directly, from the shackles of discrimination. I'm sorry. His goal was to free us not only from the shackles of discrimination, but from the shadow of poverty that haunts too many of our communities, the self-destructive impulses, and the mindless violence that claims so many people, so many lives of so many innocent young people. So poverty is the symptom of discrimination, but poverty in this formulation, and I'm just reading, equals self-destructive impulses, mindless violence, which is to essentially say that poor black people are all self-destructive and violent. First of all, as big as this system is, the vast majority of poor black folk and brown folk and white folk get up and go to work every day. And the legions of young people operating in the most post-traumatic inducing communities in our nation manage to survive and overcome and do just fine, in spite of. And yet, he's channeling King, who, best I know, and I won't pretend to be a King-ophile, but best I know, there is no well-known King speech to make any references to self-destructive black people behavior. Now, King did write an advice column for Ebony, where he got questions, sort of dirty laundry questions about how to deal with philandering, adultery, drugs, and as any preacher, he gave personal responsibility advice. Stop cheating on your wife, stop drinking to excess, so on and so forth. But this is a channeling of King that I've never heard before. So let me just read it one last time. His goal, King's goal, was to free us, not only from the shackles of discrimination, but from the shadow of poverty. that haunts too many of our communities, the self-destructive impulses and the mindless violence. King wanted to free us from our self-destructive impulses and mindless violence. Do you remember King focusing on freeing us from our own pathology? That's what that translates to.
And the president didn't use that kind of language for describing Newton.
No, he never uses it to describe. The last time he said something bad about white folks was when he talked about their guns, clinging bitterly to their guns. Next question.
Yes.
Hi. So, would you say that are you arguing to reach a goal of historical literacy among Black and white children? Do we need a educational reform, a top-down approach, or a grassroots like Alexander who argued?
That's a great question. Thank you. We need both. So we cannot accept that our educational leaders educating our children in the name of the public good, it is not acceptable that they are not educating our children on history in a responsible, complicated way. That is not acceptable. And that is a political problem. Because we elect these people, they are appointed, but they are supposed to be responsible to us. That's not acceptable. But at the same time, we can't sit on our thumbs and wait for them to get their politics right. That means that we have to do it in our communities. And what I like to say about this is part of the reason we don't do it in our community, this is going to trip you out. It's almost Orwellian. But when the FBI was engaging in counterintelligence programs, it wasn't just going after the Black Panther Party because brothers were hyper-masculine in their leather and carrying guns, which was partly legitimate, partly excessive, and wrong-headed, right? But nevertheless, that was ostensibly the main focus of attention. But they also wiped out the education programs that the Black Panther Party was doing to educate young people, to give them texts. Of course, many of those texts were socialist. Well, what else would you give to young people trying to change a capitalist system that had defined Blackness as the enemy of the state? So they went after those educational programs when they went after the Black Panther Party, not just because of the guns, but they also went after, if you read, so secret, I'm taking basically stuff for racial matters. I don't want you all to think I'm a conspiracy theorist. It is based on the release of, under Freedom of Information Act, FBI files on COINTELPRO, Racial Matters, published about 20 years ago. And there are several examples that Kenneth O'Reilly uses to describe which organizations they went after. It's going to trip you out. They went after, in Memphis, a tutorial program teaching the wrong kind, according to the FBI report, Black history. They went after Afro-American bookstores because that's where Black people were going to learn and to get all worked up. And they went after organizations that were promoting African culture in Black communities. So we live in the shadow of that repression. So how do we respond to that repression? We fight back. We pick up the fight. So the Schomburg has, and I don't want to get into propaganda about time, but the Schomburg teaches 125 kids in a Saturday program about Black history and culture from October to May. It costs us about $150,000 a year. It's hard to fundraise it for because not a whole lot of people are interested in programs like that. But those kids get 6 hours every Saturday of Black history and culture. They learn how to be journalists, they learn how to be visual artists, they learn how to be spoken word poets, they learn how to be dancers. And if I had my way, I'd make sure that every child in America, Black, white, green, or yellow, had the same opportunity. Because talk about bottom up. If we get it right, if we get this thing right where it pertains to the least of these, then the whole system will be a very different place for all of our children to grow up. So it is a grassroots effort. And Children's Defense Fund does the same things with its freedom schools. Anyone have anything to do with freedom schools? Well, they take high school and college students into these freedom schools and they teach young kids in a 6-week summer program. And it's basically close readings of classic texts because they want these kids to know this history. They want them to be informed and to be engaged. So it's both. But it costs money, and it costs time, and it costs commitment, and it costs a level of engagement where you don't have Black cultural icons, political leaders, and business folks who essentially use the bully pulpit of their celebrity to say that people who are doing that are looking backwards, are trapped in the past, are, as someone wrote in the paper just today, George Zimmerman's brother was quoted in the paper referring to the liberal media, or no, not the liberal media, those who are writing from a left point of view on Trayvon Martin's death as, gosh, I wrote it, race, what did he saw? It's a riff on an old term called race pimps. So race pimps would be Jesse Jackson, Al Sharpton, who get paid to stir up racial trouble. So, if there's no racism in America, they can't eat. But that's exactly what George Zimmerman's brother referred to in the critique of what happened to Trayvon Martin. That we need something to come. We need to put race in the situation that has nothing to do with race because that's what puts food on our table. That's real. And there are Black folks who feel the same way. A lot of them. I call them the silent Black majority. I hope they really aren't the majority, but there's enough of them I'm concerned that it might be the majority. One last question.
The slide you presented about how our criminals made, I was really compelled by that when you said that last sentence on that slide about what will you do to help this association to prevent it. I'm real product of Detroit, east side of Detroit. I look at this caption and it reminded me a lot of my upbringing. I also was reminded of when the suburbs started being formed. And my question about this northern progressiveness attack on the inner city, in your opinion, or was there data created about how suburbs were formed as a way to prevent this type of poverty and move whites,
Oh, absolutely.
and Italians, and so forth?
Absolutely. There's two great books on this. One is Origins of the Urban Crisis by Thomas DeGroot, which many people here know about. But there's another one, maybe not as well known, but equally as useful for this, called When Affirmative Action Was White, written by, do you know that one? No. But that's exactly, the point is that the very basis, and my own condemnation talks about this. Condemnation takes you through, step by step, what is their response to this problem. And their response was to build a social safety net that precedes the New Deal, precedes the GI, VA benefits, the FHA, and the very infrastructure that comes in the post-World War II period to create a white middle class. Well, the progressives are essentially laying the foundation. And that foundation looks like laws against child welfare. It looks like a robust public-private collaboration of social settlement houses or community centers that have gobs of money. Never enough, but a lot of money. There were more buildings owned by Hull House in Chicago by Jane Addams than there were buildings to address the needs of Black youth. You hear me? One organization had more resources for its orbit of youth than all of the organizations put together to serve the needs of Black folks in Chicago. And the understanding, it wasn't just benign neglect, contrary to more generous readings of social work history, which is okay, I'm fine with that. My take is different, and the evidence to me suggests differently. Part of the logic for that distinction was that Black people's problems were rooted in an internal cultural state of being that prevented the same medicine from working. It's kind of like, and I'm not really good at I'm working out this analogy, so bear with me, but some people can take beta blockers, some people can't, depending on your constitution in terms of heart management. So we couldn't get the same medicine, was the understanding, because it wouldn't work with us. And that medicine was access to these beachheads, these social interventions, these sites for saying, we got to help these kids. There was also, and this is the final example I give you, the history of prohibition is a parable of our drug prohibition today. Because part of the logic, and this is book number 2 that God, I hope it ever gets written, the job I have now, but part part of the story of Prohibition is not just a story of gangsters and alcohol bootlegging and the sensationalized story that we see on HBO